A few weeks ago, I secured a new job as the director of a psychiatric institution. While the patients themselves are manageable, it's my coworkers who are starting to unsettle me. During my interview, I met with a representative from the state, the head of the state's Department of Health and Welfare. Though polite, he was brutally honest. He informed me up front that nobody else was willing to take the position, so by default, it was mine. I was the only candidate who had met the bare minimum educational criteria. For most people, such bluntness might have been a hard pill to swallow, but for me, it felt like a stroke of luck. I had struggled to land a position anywhere, and now suddenly, an opportunity had fallen into my lap. Without hesitation, I accepted. A choice that, as of today, I have come to deeply regret. My first day began with passing through the security checkpoint. The guards instructed me to surrender my cell phone. When I questioned why, they merely pointed toward a posted sign that read, "This is a closed facility. No cell phones or external communication devices permitted beyond this point." Entering the hospital, I was immediately greeted by the janitor, a middle-aged man whose hands visibly trembled, likely the onset of Parkinson's. His demeanor was anything but welcoming. In fact, he barely acknowledged me, instead regarding me with an expression of pure annoyance. "I'll take you to your office," he muttered, irritation evident in his tone. I trailed behind him as he led me through an elongated corridor, the heavy jingle of numerous keys attached to his belt ringing through the halls. The sound was enough to attract the attention of everyone we passed. The patients, for the most part, kept to themselves. However, the staff, without fail, shot me piercing glares of resentment. It was as if they had already decided to despise me, despite having never met me before. The walk to my office gave me an unfiltered look at the facility, and the sight was anything but reassuring. The place was in complete disrepair, dilapidated and wholly unsanitary. Open trash bins overflowed with garbage, which attracted rats that feasted without a care. Many of the patients appeared as though they hadn't been bathed in days, their clothes stained and unkempt. Worse still, some had no reservations about relieving themselves right in the hallways. The stench was unbearable, thick and suffocating, yet somehow, the most disturbing aspect wasn't the filth. It was the oppressive feeling of being constantly watched. One man, in particular, caught my attention. He was an older patient, clad in a tattered hospital gown, and unlike the others, his expression mirrored the same unexplainable hostility I had received from the staff. Finally, we arrived at a door with the nameplate of my predecessor still affixed to it. Dr. Richardson. The janitor fumbled with his many keys, selecting the correct one and inserting it into the lock before pushing the door open. Without another word, he turned and began walking away. I tried offering a polite thank you, but all he responded with was a disinterested, yeah. The sound of his keys gradually faded as he disappeared down the hall. Inside my office, I found the space lined with metal filing cabinets. A desk sat at the center, upon which rested an outdated computer and an old landline phone. On the otherwise empty surface of the desk lay a single piece of paper. The heading read in bold letters, "Must read. Important information regarding several patients at the facility." It appeared that Dr. Richardson had left behind some guidance for me, a small act of consideration that I appreciated more than I expected. Being thrown into a role of this magnitude without any direction would have been overwhelming. The note began with a rundown of standard facility regulations before delving into details about specific patients. However, what it failed to mention was that any accompanying documentation had been aggressively redacted, something I discovered soon after. This individual suffers from extreme schizophrenia. Under no circumstances should she be transferred to a lower security wing, even if she appears to be improving. She is manipulative, observant, and will exploit any leniency given. If provided with an opportunity, she will cause harm to herself and others. Reading that, I felt compelled to retrieve her file. I expected to find a comprehensive medical history within, but instead, most of it had been rendered illegible by thick black ink. The only visible details were age, 42, gender, female, height, 5'1", hair color, black. Despite the heavy redactions, the little information that remained aligned with Dr. Richardson's warning. Patient 143. This individual exists in a near constant state of catatonia. However, emphasis must be placed on the word near. He will momentarily snap out of his trance if you turn your back to him. Under no circumstances should you allow him to approach from behind. His file provided the following unredacted details. Age, 28. Gender, male. Height, 5'10". Hair, bald. His documentation confirmed that he frequently experienced violent outbursts between his unresponsive episodes. The rest of his records, like the previous file, were blacked out. The list of patients continued for several pages, but toward the end, something caught my attention, an entry that was bolded, underlined, and impossible to ignore. Patient 151, do not skip. The text was written in a way that demanded urgency, ensuring that these instructions stood out starkly against the paper's white background. This patient is the most dangerous individual housed within this facility. Further details regarding his history are in his file. However, to ensure the safety of yourself and others, it is imperative that you adhere to the following rules. Do not make direct eye contact with patient 151. He does not appreciate being looked at. Do not acknowledge his presence if he moves near you. Do not say his identification number out loud. Do not mention the name Dr. Richardson in his presence. Follow these rules to the letter, and he will not make your life difficult. As you have likely gathered from the stringent security measures, this facility operates under extreme caution. The contents of this document are for your eyes only. Under no circumstances should this information be shared with anyone else. I wish you the best of luck in your new role. Best regards, Dr. Richardson. I leaned back in my chair, letting the doctor's words settle in my mind before the urge to pull 51's file took over. Digging through the cabinet, I found the manila folder tucked away at the far end. When I opened it, no surprise, most of it was blacked out. Name, redacted. Age, 71. Height, 5'3". Hair, gray. The notes painted a grim picture. NAR 51 had a long history of severe delirium and a slew of conditions that worsened his delusions. His past was violent, littered with confessions of crimes so numerous that authorities had been notified per state law. Though he had admitted himself to the facility, there was little belief that he would ever leave. His condition had continued to deteriorate, but until the courts ordered his transfer to a more secure mental institution, he remained here. A final note at the bottom caught my attention. No matter what restraints they used, he always found a way to escape. Follow protocol, and incidents could be avoided. At the very back of the folder, there was a single photograph attached to the report. A simple black and white image of an old man. His face sagged with deep wrinkles, his skin drooping off his bones. But it was his eyes that held me captive, gray, hollow, and overwhelmingly sad. There was something almost hypnotic about them, like they carried a silent message, pulling me in the longer I stared. Then, the sound of bare feet tapping against the laminate floor broke my trance. My head snapped up. A figure stood in the doorway, his gray hair matted against his head. It was the same man who had been watching me since the moment I arrived at the facility, as if he could sense I had been thinking about him. My gaze flicked between the photograph and the figure before me. They were the same person, yet something was off. The man in the picture looked worn, defeated. The man before me radiated something else, curiosity. And his eyes, they weren't the same. They were larger now, disturbingly so, almost too big for his skull, stretching his sockets to their limits. His mouth had also changed. The corners extended unnaturally, reaching toward the middle of his cheeks. Slowly, his lips curled back, revealing a wide, empty grin. Toothless, hollow. I had never seen a face like his in my life. I must have stared a second too long. His expression twisted, brows knitting together before an ear-splitting screech ripped through the room. The sound was so sharp, so unnatural, it sent pain lancing through my skull. My body tensed, my ears ringing. The note. I suddenly remembered the warning. Do not look at patient 151. He doesn't like it. Do not acknowledge him when he moves around you. I tore my gaze away, fixing it on the blank wall beside me, my heart slamming against my ribs. But it was too late. He wasn't happy. He moved forward in dragging, unnatural steps, his thin legs brushing against the edge of my desk. And then, with terrifying ease, he lunged, feet landing on the polished wood with a soft thud. His body contorted into a crouched, animal-like posture, arms hanging between his legs. Slowly, he leaned in, his breath warm against my face. I couldn't move. My muscles refused to obey. His mouth parted, and his tongue slithered out, wet and glistening. Thick saliva dripped onto my desk as the grotesque appendage inched closer, reaching for my face. But then, footsteps. The sound echoed through the hall, growing louder, closer. In an instant, 151 bolted. A blur of motion. He was gone before I could blink, disappearing around the doorframe. And then another figure emerged. I jolted, still rattled from the encounter. A woman in scrubs stepped into the room, her embroidered name tag reading, "Shh, Jenny." She hesitated, her eyes flickering with something unreadable before she spoke. "Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Clarence. I didn't mean to startle you." I barely registered her words, my mind still reeling. Then, I remembered the warning from my predecessor. "This note is for your eyes only." Without hesitation, I clutched the file and note, tucking them beneath my arm. Jenny must have known something, because she carefully avoided looking in my direction, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling instead. "Yes, Nurse Jenny. What can I do for you?" She shifted, crossing one leg over the other like a child caught interrupting something important. "Well, I thought I'd offer you a tour of the facility," she said hesitantly. "Just so you can get familiar with the place." Something about her nervousness unsettled me, but I glanced down at the hidden papers before nodding. "That sounds like a great idea. Thank you, Nurse Jenny." Sliding the documents into my desk drawer, I followed her out. The tour did little to change my first impression of the facility. It was a rotting, crumbling nightmare, the kind of place that should have been condemned years ago. I had half a mind to report this place, get it shut down. But if I did that, I'd be out of a job. The moment we stepped into the common area, the lively chatter and movement halted instantly. It was as if my arrival had drained the space of its energy. The sudden silence was only broken by a rhythmic thudding, something hard striking against the brick wall in a steady, unsettling beat. No one else seemed to acknowledge it, but my ears zeroed in on the sound. My gaze followed, and there he was, the same man who had previously leapt onto my desk. His forehead met the wall over and over again. Thud, thud, thud. The impact was so forceful that visible cracks branched out from the point of contact, splintering the surface. Then, without warning, he stopped. His body stiffened like a soldier standing at attention. In one sharp, mechanical movement, he pivoted left, his feet aligning toward me. A deep gash on his forehead wept crimson, the blood trickling down his face. I tore my eyes away, fixing them on the floor, and as suddenly as it had stopped, the room erupted back into life, the hum of conversation and movement filling the space once more. "This way, Doctor," Nurse Jenny gestured down a long corridor. Above us, a sign read, "Wing 3, Psychiatric Intensive Care Unit." At the entrance, encased in a small glass security booth, sat a lone security guard. His uniform, complete with a baseball cap, was crisp and professional. Though young, the deep furrow in his brow hinted at experience beyond his years. His focus remained locked onto the CCTV monitors before him, completely uninterested in our presence. "This is Cleese," Jenny introduced, offering a small smile. "He's not much of a talker, but when it comes to security, you won't find anyone better." I studied Cleese, waiting for some acknowledgement, but he didn't so much as glance in our direction. Unfazed, Jenny continued. "For this wing, you'll need to press this button to gain access." Reaching into the small security office, she tapped a switch on Cleese's desk. The door in front of us released with a metallic clunk and slowly creaked open, revealing a dimly lit corridor stretching into the distance. Unlike the rest of the facility, the lighting here was minimal, emergency bulbs casting only the faintest glow. The deeper I looked down the hallway, the more my skin crawled. Each side was lined with thick, reinforced metal doors, each one containing its own secret. A strange, instinctual dread curled in my stomach, whispering that something was waiting behind those doors, watching. But as my polished shoes clicked against the unforgiving floor, nothing emerged from the shadows. I let my gaze flick toward the small tempered glass windows set into a few doors, expecting to see movement. Instead, I found most of the rooms eerily vacant. We stopped in front of a door marked SHA 106. Jenny gestured toward the label next to the frame. "This is 106. You've already read through her file, right?" she asked, her voice light but expectant. There hadn't been much of a file at all, honestly. Still, I nodded, confirming her assumption. "Good," she exhaled, seeming relieved. Curiosity gnawed at me, and before I could stop myself, I peered through the small window into 106's room. A woman sat alone on the padded floor, her arms confined in a straitjacket. Slowly, her head tilted, her gaze meeting mine through the glass. Her file had given a few basic details. 42 years old, 5'1", black hair. But as I observed her, I found some discrepancies. Her features were strikingly youthful. If I hadn't known better, I'd have guessed she was in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. Her hair, though dark, wasn't quite black, more of a deep brown, in my opinion. And her height? Something about her proportions made her seem taller than the file suggested, though in her current seated position, I couldn't be certain. Her expression was distant, unfocused, drugged. Most facilities kept their patients heavily sedated. I offered a warm, reassuring smile, a quiet introduction of sorts. She parted her lips slightly as if attempting to respond, but instead of words, only a thin strand of saliva dribbled down her chin. "It's almost time for her next dose," Jenny mused from over my shoulder, standing on her tiptoes to get a better view. "I'll make sure she gets it after our little tour." She pivoted on her heel. "Come on, doctor. This way." I followed, my feet moving automatically, though my mind lingered on the woman behind the door. As we continued, another door came into view. "This is 143, Jenny announced, her voice taking on a different tone. "He's nothing to worry about as long as—" She trailed off, staring absently at the ceiling, lost in thought. Well, I'm sure his file says it all. One particular note from Dr. Richardson's file echoed in my head. "Don't turn your back to him." I stepped closer to the tempered glass and peered inside. A figure sat rigid, catatonic, his mouth slack, eyes cemented to the far wall. Just like 106, his description wasn't entirely accurate. The file had described him as completely hairless, but that wasn't quite true. A short buzz cut covered his scalp, albeit neatly trimmed. Jenny must have noticed my mild confusion. Without missing a beat, she clarified. "Oh, we shave 143's head regularly. Had an incident with his hair a few months back. Decided it was safer to keep it short." She offered the explanation casually, but her gaze drifted upward again. I had seen that nervous tick before. The compulsive fixation on ceiling tiles. It was a behavior common among my former patients, usually when they were lying. There was something she wasn't saying. "Well, that's the facility," she chirped, snapping back to her usual upbeat tone. "If you have any questions, just let me know." Jenny suddenly clapped her hands, abruptly shifting the conversation. Just then, a familiar sound reached my ears. The soft, bare footsteps I had only heard once before. Even with so little exposure, I instinctively recognized them. Jenny's eyes widened as a figure entered the edge of my vision. My throat tightened, heart hammering as the unsettling sound grew closer. There was something about 151's face that triggered something raw inside me, a fear I couldn't rationalize. My breath grew uneven. To my relief, 151 didn't acknowledge us. He simply passed by, his steps smacking against the floor as he moved down the long corridor. The moment I was certain his back was turned, I shifted slightly to get a better look. But as if sensing my movement, his head snapped in my direction. I immediately averted my gaze, fixing my eyes on the nurse before me. Jenny had noticed the brief interaction. Her fingers twitched against her arm in visible unease. When I turned toward her, her posture had changed. She had pulled inward, and her eye twitched with unmistakable tension. I had a mountain of questions about 151, but after this disturbing encounter, I never wanted to speak his name again. Another thought gnawed at me, though, and before I could stop myself, the words tumbled out. "Nurse Jenny," I blurted, my voice edged with anxiety. She snapped to attention, her gaze flicking to my lips, almost as if willing me to stay silent. "How many people actually work here?" I asked. Throughout the entire tour, I had only spotted a handful of employees, Jenny and that timid security guard included. She exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly, as if relieved by the change in topic. "So, you noticed we're short-staffed, huh?" She gave a weary half-smile. There are about 7 of us. We've been pulling extra shifts to keep up with patient care. Her eyes flickered toward the ceiling. 7 employees for a facility filled with patients? That wasn't just understaffed, it was unsustainable. From the state of the place, the peeling paint, the faint smell of mildew, and the occasional rat skittering through the halls, I'd say this facility was in a downward spiral. "Well, Nurse Jenny," I said, trying to keep my tone light, "looks like we're going to need some aggressive hiring in the next few weeks." Jenny forced a small, uneasy smile. "Yes, doctor, that would be a good idea." But her gaze drifted upward again, the flicker of suspicion returning to her expression. As we walked back down the hallway, I couldn't shake the need to glance over my shoulder. 151 was nowhere in sight. When we reached the security office, Jenny leaned inside briefly. The moment she did, a deep, chilling sensation swept over me. Like the feeling of climbing a dark staircase at night, that gut instinct that something is right behind you, just out of sight. "Thanks, Cleese," Jenny murmured to the security guard. He didn't respond. "Well, I better get back to work. A lot of patients and only one of me," she said, barely glancing in my direction before she turned to leave. I nodded, watching her, but something about her words lingered uncomfortably in my mind. Everyone here seemed off. "Of course," I replied, offering a small tilt of my head in acknowledgement. Jenny disappeared into the quiet halls, leaving me alone with Cleese. I hadn't paid him much attention before, but now, standing in the doorway, I realized how intensely he was staring at me. His gaze felt invasive, like he was peeling back layers of my skin just by looking. His eyes had a strange glassy quality, but his mouth betrayed something else. A slow, creeping grin, the kind that sent shivers down my spine. His lips parted slightly, and I noticed the faint gleam of saliva. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. My body tensed, and though I didn't want to, I held his gaze for a moment too long. Something in my expression must have broken whatever strange trance he was in, because his eyes eventually flicked back to the security monitors. Unnerved, I spun on my heel and walked briskly toward my office, the unease pressing down on me with every step. But just before I turned the corner, I hesitated. Against my better judgment, I glanced back. Cleese was still watching. His stare followed me like a predator sizing up prey, and for a fleeting second, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being hunted. I practically threw myself into my office, locking the door behind me. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. Something was wrong with this place. Not just with 151, but with everyone. Jenny included. Needing some sense of control, I moved straight to my desk, yanking the drawer open. Tony, I had left 151's file here, untouched. But as the wooden drawer reached its stopper, my stomach lurched. The drawer was empty. No file, no note, nothing. Panic set in. I tore through my desk, my hands rifling through every cabinet, every folder, every scrap of paper. But no matter where I searched, the documentation was gone. My fingers dug into the edge of the desk as I slumped into my chair, defeat pressing down on my shoulders. It was my first day here, and I had already lost crucial paperwork. I pressed my palms over my eyes, trying to force clarity into my thoughts. But all I could feel was the creeping realization that something was very, very wrong with this place. Just as my nerves started to settle, a sudden sharp noise shattered the fragile calm. Bang, bang, bang. My head snapped up, eyes darting toward the door. The sound came again, insistent, rhythmic. Bang, bang, bang. But something was off. It wasn't coming from the door itself. It echoed from the wall just beside it. The memory of patient 151 relentlessly pounding his skull against the common room wall rushed back, sending a shiver through me. My pulse quickened. I forced myself up from the chair as silently as possible. Though my efforts were wasted, the chair let out a loud, grating noise against the floor. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" No response. I hesitated, fingers tightening around the door handle. Taking a deep breath, I cracked the door open, just enough to peek out. The hinges let out a soft squeak, the dim hallway stretching out in front of me, empty. But then, a different sound broke the silence. A soft jingle, the distinct chime of keys, followed by the rhythmic slosh of water and the harsh scrape of wood dragging across laminate flooring. My gaze traveled down the corridor, where a flickering light revealed a figure at the far end. The janitor. Something about the way he moved sent a prickle of unease through me. The mop wasn't being used correctly. Instead of pressing the wet head to the ground, he held it in the air, using the handle to trace deliberate strokes against the floor, as though he were painting rather than cleaning. The keys on his belt jangled with every motion, a haunting melody against the stillness of the hall. He stood directly beneath one of the pothole lights, the artificial glow highlighting the eerie precision of his movements. My fingers curled tighter around the doorframe. As a psychologist, I'd studied psychotic breaks before. I knew one when I saw one. And at that moment, I was certain that I was witnessing something profoundly disturbed. Before I could process my next move, a shadow stepped into view. Nurse Jenny emerged from an intersecting hallway. She approached the janitor, her lips moving in a whisper as she leaned in close. Then they both stopped. For an unsettling moment, neither of them moved. Then, as though controlled by an unseen force, their heads turned toward me in unison. My stomach dropped. The warm, welcoming expression Jenny had greeted me with earlier was gone, replaced by something ice-cold, brimming with silent hatred and disdain. Her eyes locked onto mine, dark and unreadable. The janitor wore the same expression, mirroring her as if they were bound by a shared, silent understanding. The mop clattered to the floor. Without breaking eye contact, they turned and vanished into the darkened hallway, leaving me standing there, my skin crawling. A sharp buzz snapped my attention in the opposite direction. The pothole light on the far end of the corridor hummed aggressively, flickering in and out. Beneath its cold glow stood patient 151. He was motionless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes locked onto the buzzing light above him. His entire body seemed frozen in place, but something about his posture felt wrong. His arms hung stiffly behind his back, but his elbows twisted in a way that defied human anatomy, bending beyond their limits. His fingers, long and jagged, twitched slightly as if moving against his will. His mouth hung open, far too wide. The longer I stared, the more I realized what was happening. His jaw was fighting against itself, joints popping and crackling as if something inside him was forcing it open. The sickening sound of bones shifting filled the corridor. His mouth stretched wider and wider until, with a grotesque snap, his jaw fully dislocated. Then, the light flickered violently. His body seized. The buzzing intensified, growing louder until, with a sharp pop, the bulb shattered, sending shards of glass raining down on him. Before I could react, the destruction spread. The bulbs lining the entire hallway burst one after another in rapid succession, filling the air with smoke and the acrid scent of burning wires. The entire corridor plunged into darkness. Silence. Nothing moved. Only my own shallow, terrified breaths broke the suffocating quiet. Then, the fire alarms shrieked to life, their deafening howls filling every inch of the space. Red strobe lights pulsed in sync with the sirens, casting sharp, disorienting flashes across the hallway. And in those brief moments of illumination, I saw him. Patient 151 hadn't moved. He stood exactly where he had been before, a statue frozen in time. But then his left hand gave the smallest, most imperceptible twitch, and in an instant, the nightmare truly began. His fingers curled inward, folding into his palm. Then his palm collapsed inward, pulling into his forearm, and then his entire arm retracted into his torso. A hollow indent formed where his shoulder had been, as if his body were swallowing itself from the inside. My stomach churned at the sight, a cold nausea gripping me as I watched his flesh ripple. And then the real horror began. Something was moving inside him. The limb twisted and churned beneath his skin, forcing its way upward. My breath hitched as I saw it bulge through his collarbone, pushing up his throat. The movement stretched his already gaping mouth even wider. Then, slowly, methodically, fingers began to emerge from his throat. It was his own hand. But it wasn't just his hand. A head was following it. My mind struggled to process what I was witnessing, but it was unmistakable. He was turning himself inside out. His body folded in on itself like a grotesque, living fabric being reversed. Flesh stretched, muscle twisted, skin peeled back. The sight was unnatural, horrifying. The strobing lights caught the glistening wetness of his insides, now fully exposed to the open air. And then, in a moment of sheer unthinking horror, I whispered, "Oh my God." The second the words left my lips, 151's disfigured face snapped toward me with unnatural speed. A realization hit me like ice water. I had just broken one of Dr. Richardson's rules. Don't acknowledge patient 151. He broke into a full sprint while I stumbled back into my office, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath hitched as I peered through the small window, expecting 151's grotesque face to emerge any second. Seconds dragged into minutes, yet nothing appeared over the edge of the window. Hesitant, I crept closer, bracing myself for him to lunge, but the hallway remained eerily empty, illuminated only by the flickering strobe lights. Patient 151 had vanished. This isn't real. This isn't happening. My thoughts spun in frantic repetition. I needed answers immediately. Rushing to my computer, I pulled up the patient roster and searched for patient 151. The screen flickered before an error message appeared. Patient 151 does not exist. A shiver crawled up my spine. My lips trembled as I whispered, "What the hell?" Jenny's face flashed in my mind, and my fingers flew over the keyboard as I searched the hospital's employee records, typing in her name. The screen distorted momentarily before loading her profile, and the moment I saw it, my blood ran cold. The woman in the file photo was not the same Nurse Jenny who had greeted me. Instead, the picture showed the face of patient 106, the woman I had seen strapped into a straitjacket inside the padded cell. My pulse pounded as I clicked on patient 106's file, holding the screen up to the light. The official documentation had been blacked out, but the bright glow revealed faint outlines of the concealed text beneath. My eyes traced the hidden words, my heartbeat hammering with every letter I deciphered. Patient 106 is highly manipulative and dangerously intelligent. She distorts reality so thoroughly that she nearly convinces herself of her own lies. However, she has a tell whenever she fabricates a story. Her gaze instinctively flickers toward the ceiling. A sickening realization settled in my stomach. The way Nurse Jenny had looked up whenever she was nervous, it wasn't a habit. It was a sign. She was lying. She wasn't a nurse at all. Then, another thought hit me like a freight train. Sevis, the security guard. My hands shook as I pulled up his staff profile, dread tightening its grip around my throat. When the image loaded, I felt like the floor had been ripped from beneath me. The photo wasn't of Sevis at all. It was patient 143. The man in a constant state of catatonia. But here in the staff image, he had a full head of hair, not the shaved scalp I had seen earlier. My mind flashed back to the security guard's hat. He had never removed it. Was it because he was bald underneath? Do not turn your back on him. Dr. Richardson's note echoed in my mind. I pictured Sevis, his expression subtly shifting every time I wasn't looking directly at him. The realization made my skin crawl. And then, the janitor. His trembling hands. I had assumed he suffered from Parkinson's, but now it was obvious. Those weren't tremors of disease. They were withdrawal symptoms. He wasn't sick. He was an addict. And then it struck me. While the fake Nurse Jenny had distracted me with a tour, the janitor had gone into my office. He had rifled through my belongings. He had stolen the note and 151's file. Desperate, I searched the hospital's janitorial records. My stomach dropped. The man I had seen earlier, the one mopping the floor, wasn't listed anywhere. He didn't exist. A surge of nausea rolled through me as I gripped the desk for support. The patients had taken over the facility. The real staff had been subdued. I was trapped in a building teeming with freed psychopaths. My hands shook as I grabbed the landline, pressing it to my ear. Silence. The line had been cut. I let out a low, frustrated growl. I needed to get help. I had to free the real hospital staff. My mind reeled back to the woman in room 106, her vacant stare, the saliva trickling down her chin. I could hear the imposter Jenny's voice in my head, cheerful, oblivious. It's almost time for her next dose. This wasn't a real nurse. She wasn't caring for anyone. She was drugging them, keeping them so sedated they couldn't fight back. If I didn't act fast, the real Nurse Jenny could be given a lethal dose, and the man impersonating 143, he might already be beyond saving. I had to reach Wing 3, but patient 151 was still out there. I tried sending distress signals through my computer, emails, security alerts, anything, but no one responded. I cursed under my breath. This place was locked down too tightly. Desperation clawed at my chest. With no other options, I turned to online chat forums, sending out frantic messages. Someone, somewhere had to know something about 151. His condition was beyond anything I understood. His symptoms didn't feel medical. They felt demonic. Please, please. If anyone has information about patient 151, send it to me before it's too late. I didn't have much time. If no one could help me, I would have to risk everything and run for it. I couldn't let Jenny get away with whatever she was planning. I kept replaying the classified note I had seen in 151's file. No matter what we try, the patient always finds a way to escape. A sharp creak echoed from the hallway. My blood turned to ice. My office door wouldn't hold him for long. Please, help me. I don't want to die.